Thank you. Thank you very much. And General Cody, thank you for that very eloquent introduction. I don't know if all those things were quite all on my plate, but sir, thank you so very much. Well, good evening.
Good evening, sir.
It's a tremendous honor for me to join all of you tonight at a place that is steeped in Army history and in the history of our nation. And being a native Virginian in a beautiful part of the country, the Shenandoah Valley in the spring, and what a beautiful sight it was traveling down here today. What a privilege it is for all of us here to have the opportunity to walk the ground where the spirit of American legends like Washington, Lee, and Marshall is very much alive and well. I would like to thank and recognize some very special Army leaders who are here with us this evening. First and foremost, two of our former Army Vice Chiefs of Staff, General James P., VMI class of 1962 and presently the VMI Superintendent. Please join me in recognizing the Superintendent. And also General Richard Cody, Chairman of the Marshall Seminar, former Vice Chief of Staff of the Army, who I spent a lot of time with in the Pentagon. And so when he says I take credit for those systems out there, he was the one that was directing to get those systems there and fought for the resources. Please join me in recognizing General Cody. Gentlemen, we're honored by your presence, and we thank you both, not only for your magnificent service in uniform, but for all you continue to do for the men and women of our Army and this nation. I also want to thank Mr. Brian Shaw and everyone at the Marshall Foundation for your very hard work in maintaining the legacy of one of our Army's greatest leaders and one of our nation's greatest statesmen, and for sponsoring another successful seminar this year, the 35th seminar. And I also want to add my thanks and congratulations to Major General Jeffrey Smith. Congratulations on assuming the reins, Jeff, of the new commanding general of the U.S. Army Cadet Command, a great officer whom you will have an opportunity to meet, who will build the next generation of Army leaders. Also with General Smith tonight is Command Sergeant Major Turner. Thanks for being here. Most of all, though, I want to congratulate the extraordinary cadets here with us tonight on your outstanding achievement. You should be very, very proud. As I look out at all of you, you look so professional, you look so distinguished, and you look so young. At least most of you look so young. And as a proud product of the ROTC program myself, only a short 32 years ago, I was a lot like many of you. I attended Virginia State University, as General Cody mentioned, in Petersburg, Virginia. Go Trojans, I didn't hear it. All right. And believe me, if you had told me back then that one day I'd be delivering a speech to a group of our Army's and our nation's top cadets, and as a general officer, I would have been stunned, probably speechless. However, although I was a pretty good cadet, I never received the Marshall Award, but I greatly admired those who did. And so I do hope you recognize the significance of this achievement and the opportunities to attend this seminar. It's something that I wish every cadet would have an opportunity to witness and experience. Now, I think you should know that I'm somewhat challenged tonight as the after-dinner speaker. You all have had a long day, starting with PT this morning. You're sitting in some comfortable pews. The lights have been dimmed down a little bit, so I must confess, my true goal and objective is to ensure I stop talking before you stop listening. And as I was thinking about what I wanted to talk to you about tonight, I have to admit also that I felt somewhat apprehensive. After all, what do you say to some of America's finest young men and women who volunteered to serve their nation during a time of war? Well, the first and perhaps the most important thing I think you'd want to say is actually pretty straightforward and simple, and that is thank you. Thank you for your willingness to serve our Army and our nation during this critical time. Seated in this chapel, this historic chapel this evening, is a group of extraordinarily talented young people who could have chosen to do just about anything they desired with their lives. You could have pursued successful careers in science, engineering, politics, business, education, or the arts. And all of those are certainly worthwhile and important endeavors. But instead, you volunteered to serve in the uniform of an American soldier. And tonight, you're only a short time away from earning your commissions as officers and second lieutenants and becoming members of our profession of arms. So again, thank you. And what I find even more remarkable is that while many of you here tonight are now 21 or 22 years old and seniors in college, at 8:48 in the morning on September the 11th, 2001, the very moment when Flight 11 crashed into the north face of the North Tower of the World Trade Center, you were only 10 or 11 years old and still in elementary school. And every day since then, you've lived in a nation at war. In fact, a nation that's now fighting its longest war in history. So you grew up watching as hundreds of thousands of men and women, some of them perhaps your dads or moms or uncles or aunts or cousins or other relatives, even some of your fellow cadets who are here tonight, deployed to war in Iraq and Afghanistan, perhaps multiple times. And if there is any generation in our nation's history who truly know what it means to serve in uniform and who know about the sacrifices it requires, it's all of you. It's your generation. And yet, you volunteered to serve anyway. You know, when you watch the news lately, you hear a lot about the 1% and the 99%. Well, you're part of a very different 1%. You all are part of the less than 1% of Americans who serve in the uniform of our armed forces. That's right. During the longest war in our nation's history, less than 1% of Americans serve in uniform. And that includes all services, active duty, National Guard, and Reserve. So my first and foremost important message for you tonight is just that simple. Thank you. Thank you for volunteering to serve at such a critical time in history of our Army and of our nation. And believe me, this is a critical time. A few moments ago, I talked about watching the news. Well, it's all too easy to watch the news these days and become a bit of a pessimist. After all, there's no shortage of stories that detail difficult challenges facing our Army. Think about it for a moment. As we gather here this week, our Army is still engaged in a very tough combat mission in Afghanistan. After recently successfully concluding the longest war in our nation's history in Iraq, while transforming and reshaping for the very different battlefields we may confront in the future, and while also entering an era of declining budgets and force structure reductions. And our Army is doing all of this at a moment when our nation has endured some of the toughest economic times we've seen since the Great Depression. With all of that going on, it'd be easy to become a pessimist. However, Army has faced tougher times before. I remember when I was a young college student and an Army ROTC cadet in the late 1970s. Our Army was emerging from a long war in Vietnam. And we were also confronting an era of reduced budgets and significant personnel reductions. Army was also transforming and reshaping, sound familiar? Itself to better confront a growing Soviet threat in Europe and around the globe. And despite all of this, as a result of some tremendous leaders, two who are sitting here on my right and your left, Army emerged stronger than ever and became the Army that deployed victoriously to Desert Shield and Desert Storm. And over the course of our history, we've done it time and time again. Try just for a moment to imagine what it must have been like to be General George C. Marshall. On the day he was sworn in as the 15th Chief of Staff of our Army, September the 1st, 1939, the German Army invaded Poland, launching the Second World War. On that day, General Marshall assumed leadership of an army that consisted of only 180,000 soldiers, many of them with outdated equipment, and many ill-trained for the fight that would ultimately lie ahead. And not only that, but in 1939, our nation was also still suffering from the effects of a Great Depression. But over the course of the next 36 months, under General Marshall's extraordinary leadership, the U.S. Army would expand from roughly 180,000 soldiers to a trained and fully equipped force of more than 5 million, and ultimately to more than 8 million by 1945. In fact, so great were General Marshall's accomplishments during the Second World War that Winston Churchill called him the true organizer of victory. Later, Churchill would go on to say of General Marshall that, quote, "There are few men whose qualities of mind and character have impressed me so deeply as those of General Marshall. He has always fought victoriously against defeatism, discouragement, and disillusion. Succeeding generations must not be allowed to forget his achievements and his example." Unquote. And others who've studied General Marshall's extraordinary life have remarked that optimism was one of the qualities that, for him, distinguished the most successful officers. General Colin Powell must have also believed this as well, also an ROTC graduate from the City College of New York, class of 1958, when he once said, and I quote, "Perpetual optimism is a force multiplier," unquote. So my second message to you tonight is don't listen to the pessimists. Be optimistic. For me, throughout my career, the glass is always half full, and tomorrow will always be a brighter day. Because if our Army and our nation can survive and thrive during tough times like we've had in the past and I've just spoken about, we can definitely overcome the challenges we confront today. The truth is, today is an absolutely great time to become an Army officer. And Army will need great leaders like you, as we've had in the past, Marshall Award recipients, to lead our transition into the future. Last year, when General Dempsey, our current chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, spoke at this same Marshall seminar, he said that one piece of advice he'd received when he first became Army Chief of Staff was to get one of those wristbands that people wear and to have written on it the words, "What would George Marshall do?" For all of us who are privileged to lead soldiers, I think it's also important to reflect on this great leader, this great soldier statesman. First and foremost, for all the many truly historic accomplishments of General Marshall's life. His leadership during World War II, his plan for the reconstruction of Europe after the war, his service as Secretary of State, his service as Secretary of Defense, his receipt of the Nobel Peace Prize in 1953. And I could go on and on and on and on. However, I believe the most important reason to reflect on General Marshall's life is his extraordinary character. Because he truly exemplifies the character we seek most in Army leaders. To use General Marshall's own words, quote, "The most important factor of all is character, which involves integrity, unselfish and devoted purpose, a sturdiness of bearing when everything goes wrong and all are critical, and a willingness to sacrifice self in the interest of the common good," unquote. Ever since I received my commission as a second lieutenant, I've always been told that if you take care of your character, your reputation will take care of itself. And it is your reputation that will precede you at every assignment throughout your career. As future officers and leaders in our Army, I can think of no better advice to give you this evening than General Marshall's words. Words that in his case were born out of actions, words like integrity and self-sacrifice. As you begin serving in our Army, you will be allowed to make mistakes. And believe me, you will. I made many throughout my career. But what you will never be allowed to do is compromise your integrity under any circumstances. Integrity is the one character trait that can never be taken away from you. You have to give it away. So remember, under any circumstances. When it comes to sacrificing self-interest in favor of the common good, there are few in history of our Army who can match General Marshall. As the planning for World War II's D-Day landing was underway, many assumed that General Marshall would be selected to lead the Allied invasion of Europe, an operation that would be the largest of its kind in history, and that if successful, would turn the tide of the war in favor of the Allies. Everyone knew at the time that whoever led the D-Day invasion would certainly be remembered as one of history's greatest generals. President Franklin Roosevelt is said to have met privately with General Marshall in order to personally offer him command of the invasion force. However, General Marshall deferred, responding to President Roosevelt that, quote, "It is for the President to decide. I will serve wherever you order me, Mr. President," unquote. Of course, we all now know that President Franklin Roosevelt ultimately appointed General Eisenhower to lead the Allied invasion force, telling General Marshall, I quote, "General, I feel I could not sleep at night with you out of the country," unquote. And General Marshall never uttered a single word of hint, of criticism, or protest. Ladies and gentlemen, that's putting the common good above self-interest. And although you may never be faced with circumstances quite like those confronted by General Marshall, as you go about the events of the seminar this week over the next few days, I'd ask you to take some time to learn about and reflect upon the life and service of this extraordinary general officer and leader that this seminar is named after. And to commit yourselves every day as you wear the uniform of an Army officer to living by his example of character. If you do, You will earn the respect of the soldiers you lead, of the peers who serve shoulder to shoulder alongside you, of the commanders who will place trust and confidence in your abilities, and of the American people who most importantly look to you for their defense and uphold the values of our Army and our nation. I have every confidence that you will succeed. Once again, I want to thank you for allowing me to join you this evening. Congratulations to all of you once again. It will be an honor for me to serve alongside you in our great Army, and I look forward to 30 years or so from now, seeing one of you come back as a guest speaker for the Marshall ROTC Awards dinner. Godspeed, Army strong, take care of yourselves. Cool.